Hello, and welcome to this Bournbrook interview. I'm Wickett, and I'm joined by Ben Crocket, who documented the recent Bristol uprising. Ben, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me on.
No worries. I thought I'd start off by just getting you to briefly overview what you witnessed and how you became aware that something big was happening.
Absolutely. So it was the Sunday, which I believe was the first protest. There's been quite a few now, and being the sort of lazy student I was having a nap in the middle of the afternoon, and I woke up and I heard lots of chanting right outside my building. So I was quite curious, So I decided to go and head down and just see what it was all about. And I found out it was, the Kill the Bill protest about the police and crime sentencing bill. So I went and joined it. I'm not really a protester type, but I thought it was a good cause, and I was interested just to go see what was going on, really. It's on Bridewell Street in Bristol, which is quite a central street. It's basically the street I live on, and they were all gathered outside the police station. So I sort of went to see, and for the most part, in the early beginning sort of stages, it was just sort of standard protest, signs, chants. There's a little bit of pushing and shoving with the police at the front line, but mostly, fairly normal protests. And sort of as the night went on, or afternoon and then night went on, it sort of escalated, and you sort of saw it sort of stirring up, and a bit more violence, a bit more pushing and shoving, and sort of windows started getting smashed, and stuff getting thrown, and eventually it really, as I'm sure many people saw in the news, it basically ended up as a full-scale riot on my street. Police getting hurt, vans getting set on fire, and really got out of control. So I witnessed that, and I sort of documented that, and then throughout the week, really, on from there, there was intermittent protests, some more peaceful than others, just bigger than others. Some maybe 100 people. One of them, I believe it was the Friday, though I might be getting that day wrong, which I documented quite a fair bit. It was like 1,000 people were out marching through the streets of Bristol. And then they would sort of march around to College Green, which anyone who knows Bristol is like the sort of central area where lots of people tend to gather with these sorts of things, and marched around, and huge police presence. Right. And that again in the evening sort of kicked off again. So it's been really all week. I've been trying to get as much footage as I can, but
let's because you covered two of the three major events, right? So
yes,
let's stay with the first one for now.
Yeah.
In your footage, I noticed a lot of black bloc in the crowd. Like sort of hoodies and masks and whatever.
Yeah.
Was it clear at any point that there were people in the crowd who were agitating for a riot?
I think it was a small minority of people who were, although early on it wasn't clear that they were straight up agitating for a riot, it was clear that, like you say, the people who know the sort of telltale signs, they come in the black bloc, they've got them face covered, they're all sort of unified, and they would tend to be in small little groups kind of talking at the back. And I think they picked up on what was an increasingly sort of hostile crowd. So that you had like you would say, like the agitator types who were there for maybe more ideological reasons. And then you had the sort of general crowd. So I think, although it wasn't definitely clear, I think in retrospect, looking back, you can see who the people who were going to sort of push. And you could definitely tell those sort of people were definitely the ones more at the front line, right, sort of pushing and shoving and trying to get like riot shields away from the police and things like that, rather than the general, the regular protester type. They come with signs, they look a little bit hippie-ish, they're generally quite polite and nice to talk to. So I would say there's definitely a distinction, yeah.
Right, yeah. At what point did you know it was time for you to get out of there on the first night?
Well, I actually stayed pretty late. I mean, I was, as I said, literally my building was literally right there. So I decided what I was going to do, especially because my phone kept running out of charge. I was like, I'll just keep coming out, filming a bit, and then going back, updating all the social medias, usually roll a cigarette, come back out, And although certain parts of it really escalated, like, for example, when you had the van set on fire, like the fuel tank explode from that, and you had other things set on fire, things get smashed up. I never felt threatened directly by the crowd. Right. It was a very sort of, we're here to, even the more violent people, it was like, we're here to fight with the police, you know? Yeah. So I say I really stayed until right at the end when the police were sort of really clearing people out. And I think as soon as it became clear the police had re-established control, a lot of the troublemakers just left or backed off.
How long did that take?
Sort of a vague estimate. It's hard to say exactly, but it was a vague estimate from when I got there, which was probably like 5 p.m. It was probably a good 5 hours, maybe 6. Like, I mean, it took a long time before they were able to really re-establish control.
Right. Okay. Did you see how they did it? Was it like kettling or?
There was a lot of talk of kettling. I heard like the crowd would. I heard people, talking to people in the crowd. There was a lot of like, "Oh my god, the police are going to start kettling," but I didn't actually see any. More what it was is that people they just showed up in sort of larger and larger numbers, right. Gradually though, very very slowly, and then would slowly retake an area. Like they managed to block off the sort of side street that the van was on fire on, and then they managed to sort of push back to basically the end of my building on one side. And so they would just gradually kind of retake a small little area and then guard it as long as they could. And then if they got the opportunity, take another little area. But I think really that first night, the big thing was them just waiting for people to go home because they just kind of knew we don't have the numbers. I imagine they were trying to call, people in from further away because I don't know how many police Bristol has sort of on call. Yeah. But yeah, I think that was the best chance they had.
Did it feel like the police were unprepared for it to turn violent on the first night?
Absolutely. I mean, it was actually quite shocking to me how unprepared they were. I mean, even for them to turn up in force in riot gear, took a long time. There was a small lot of them in riot gear from early on, but at one point, I mean, we're talking hours in, they were basically only able to defend a few meters outside the front of the police station.
Right. Yeah.
That was it. And the whole rest of the street and the surrounding streets were that was the riots as sort of territory.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the videos I saw was one of the vans getting attacked and police were just sort of watching it happen.
There was a lot of that. But and in fairness to the police, I found it quite shocking at the time. But in fairness to the police, I think it was a case of like, we don't feel like we have the numbers to retake it permanently. And if we retake it and then lose it again, but I literally watched. I mean, that was one I saw that sort of thing happen a couple of times. But the worst one I saw was, so you had the van that was set on fire, which was closer to the police station, and I say they retook that area relatively quickly. But then there was a car set on fire further down the same street, so you could still see the police station, but it was further away. And that took. They didn't really retake that until like basically the end of the thing, and they managed to get a fire truck down to it eventually to put it out, and then the fire truck left, and then they didn't try and take it. So the protesters rioters just walked back up and just lit the thing back on fire.
Right.
So I mean, it was literally out for maybe half an hour max, and then it was just back on fire.
Yeah. I saw one video of a bloke trying to set the car on fire while there were police still in the van.
I watched that happen as well. Unfortunately, my phone was dead at the time. I couldn't get phone, but yeah, I heard about that. I think somebody did get video of it. Fortunately. That was by far the worst thing I saw. I mean, certainly, setting vans on fire and stuff like that is completely out of order. But to be doing it while someone was in the van,
it's attempted murder.
Yeah, literally, just a straight up attempted murder. And the other thing was, luckily, the guy obviously realised what was happening. Whoever was driving, but they were kind of a bit pinned in because, like, on one side you had the flaming van, and then ahead you had like other parked vans that have been abandoned to use as like a blockade. So he didn't have many places to go. I think he managed to kind of get up on the pavement and try and get around the corner a bit. But yeah, it was a bad situation. When I saw that, I was like, this could get really bad.
One of the most iconic pieces of footage was the station getting attacked and people, hitting the windows with skateboards and whatever. Have you seen the station since? And what's it like now?
It's in pretty good nick now. And I think, as far as I could tell, I think some of the damage to the actual station was slightly overhyped in the media. It definitely was attacked, and they definitely to smash in windows, and there was some graffiti and things like that. But it wasn't like the next day you looked at it and it was a wreck. It was still in pretty good nick, and I think they fixed a few things. So you could definitely still see that something had gone on, but it was relative. Not to downplay the significance of attacking a police station, but I think some of the media sort of reports on that slightly overhyped it.
Let's move on to the second night, where it seemed to me that the police were, one, much more prepared, and two, much better equipped.
Absolutely.
And, there's a much more like horse presence, a lot more mounted, a lot more vehicles in place, a lot more officers in place. What to you was a major difference between night one and night two in terms of police response and the tactics of the protesters?
Yeah, so I definitely 100% you're correct to say that they were much more prepared and much better equipped. They were there in force. They had the police station was essentially completely blocked off before the protesters even got there. I mean, when I arrived at that one, which I think was on the Friday, I think I'm correct to say that. There was a small crowd gathered outside near the police station, but as I said, they couldn't get to the bit where they had been before because it was blocked off not only by riot police but also by a line of police vans. And then you had the march arrive, which is I think at one point was reported to be up to 1,000 people, and having been on the ground, it seemed like it was that sort of size. Was sort of just turning up. So even before the bulk of the crowd had even got there, protest aside, I want to give credit where credit's due, because I think there's a lot of people who get upset with you when you only report the sort of negative side of it, and I think you need to give the both sides. And on that protest day, up until really quite late, maybe 10, something like that, and the protest started early afternoon sort of time, it was model protest, completely peaceful. They were actually chanting peaceful protest. The march went round, nothing was damaged, nothing was hurt. There was a really good atmosphere. I would say there was less, particularly as I say during the day, a lot less of the sort of those black blocs or type people. It was really, I was actually quite impressed. And I say it was a cause I personally feel quite enthusiastic about, and I was really pleased to see that sort of atmosphere of the riot and the violence hadn't just carried on mostly during the day. So I was very happy to see that. Later on, they stayed sort of, the march arrived back at the police station eventually, sort of did a big loop around the city. And then they'd stay sort of a sit-in, which is classic peaceful protester tactics. And then I think what happened, I wasn't actually there at the moment it kicked off, but I was there sort of not long before and not long after, and I spoke to quite a few people who were there on the ground at the time. And the impression I got was that basically the pushing and shoving at the front of the police line started again. Not as severe, but still relatively severe. People fighting a little bit with the police, and so there was and throwing stuff, from the back. And there was a sort of response from the police of like, if you try and take our riot shields, we're going to be quite forceful, which kind of escalated, both sides sort of ramping up. And then the police decided, right, if we don't do something, this is influence on my part, but this is from what I can gather. The police decided basically if we allow this to keep escalating, we might end up with a situation like we had, only less than a week prior. And so they decided we're going to clear the area, basically, by whatever means sort of we need to. And that's when I think a lot of the mounted units started getting involved. Capture, although it was quite late on and it was quite far from the main protest site, charged. So what they were doing was they'd have a riot line, and then the riot line would split, and the police would have I think it was 6 or 7 horses, something like that, in full with officers and everything, and they would charge, clear the area, and then the riot line would come forward. So although it was definitely more aggressive, and there was a sort of period where there was much more aggression, it seemed like it was pretty brief in comparison to all the rest. You had the one side where it was completely peaceful all day. You had this sort of brief period of sort of escalation from both sides. I would say the police definitely seemed a little excessive from some of the videos and people I spoke to. But I think they were more motivated this time to kind of keep control of the situation for obvious reasons. And then they sort of dispersed, and you had this gradual process of them pushing them away, but it was much more a sort of traditional police just pushing protesters away rather than a riot.
Right. Okay. So
that was my experience.
You mentioned that sort of there was wrongdoing on both sides. That the police, as you said, were a tad excessive, and also the rioters had no business rioting in the first place. It's become another one of those events where, depending on your political allegiance, you take one side wholeheartedly, right? You're on the side of the police, on the side of the protesters. So, what is it that the pro-police side got wrong, and what is it that the pro-protest side got wrong?
That's a great question. And I think just quickly before I answer, I would say that this has been quite a enlightening thing for me, because I think a lot of us who are sort of politically aware, we know that these sort of biases play into reporting, right? But I think having experienced it firsthand on the ground, so I would say probably on the pro-police side, the thing that people have got most wrong would be they've been sort of, there's been a lot of reports of people turning to violence or talking about people sort of being violent. I think before it really all kicked off, like I'm all for sort of people being violent when they're being violent, but I saw a lot on Twitter, especially, you know, I'm on the right myself, but especially a lot of sort of right-wing accounts and people who lean that, you know, the very pro-police way, that would sort of put a lot of posts like, oh, it's all kicking off in Bristol again.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I'm here and it's not kicking off, you know? So like, be careful about going over top with that.
That's kind of pure politics, though, isn't it? Like everyone low key loves it when their opponents start rioting, because it gives you
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And then on the other side, on the sort of people who are more pro-protest, you know, generally more left-leaning, but you know, it goes both ways. You had, I think, the excessive, a bit like you're saying, when sort of the people you like to criticize are doing something wrong, sort of the excessive pushback on the police behavior. So that you would get a lot of what I noticed a lot. I think Owen Jones did this a lot. You know, these sort of people who would post like a 3-second clip of not any context of what happened beforehand, and then like the police shoving someone with a riot shield, and then they, you know, cry fascist. And it's like, look, watching a video of somebody getting pushed to the ground with a riot shield, you know, that's obviously horrible, and it might have been totally inappropriate, right? We don't know, but if you have no context of what's happening right before that, and in a couple of cases, it was and you wouldn't necessarily know if you weren't there sort of what was happening, but there was like, there's the front line of the police officers, right, who are all in riot gear, and then there's a big crowd, and the big crowds are sort of pushing towards the line of riot police officers and like trying to take their shields, fighting with them, throwing stuff. And somebody walks up and is like pushing or trying to grab a riot shield from an officer, and they sort of forcefully push them off. And it's like, look, if you just see that like tiny little, you know, clip of it, you might think, oh wow, that was really out of order. But when you realize there's, you know, hundreds of people behind who are behaving violently towards this line of officers, and you're trying to take his only protection away from him, you know, a forceful response is probably justified, even if in every case maybe they went, you know, in some cases they went a bit too far. So I definitely say both sides fell into their sort of typical biases.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's sort of to be expected, to be honest, isn't it?
Yeah, it's nothing out of ordinary really, but it's still worth thinking about when you're watching the coverage.
Were the police able to tell riders apart from observers and treat each accordingly?
That's a good question. I think on the first night it was more difficult, certainly, to do that, because they had so little control of the situation. And so I think they kind of end up in a mentality of like, we kind of have to treat everyone as a potential rioter here, because we're so outnumbered, and if we let anyone behind the lines or we do anything like that, it can end so very badly. The second time I was there on the Friday, I think much more so they were able to control. Like I don't know if you saw some of the videos, I actually managed to get up right behind the line, and like next to the mounted officers, and there was a few people, it wasn't just me, you know, but they were all obviously just kind of watching, seeing what was going on. A lot of people were taking videos on their phones, and so that I would say a lot more that second time, but it was because they had control of the situation. You know, they were dictating who moved when. There was no chance of them being broken through, so they could take a lot more liberty.
Right. Yeah. I want to talk a bit about Bristol as a city. It's I mean, I've seen a lot of people comparing it to Portland recently. In the wake of this, I mean, it's not like Portland. It's not anywhere near as unstable as Portland. But there is a culture of activism in Bristol, right? I mean, we saw the Colston statue, and as a city, it's a very sort of, you know, left wing studenty sort of place, right?
Definitely.
Did the culture of the city almost lean into the violence a little bit? Was it almost a product of the area it's in, where compared to somewhere like, I don't know, somewhere like Birmingham or Manchester, where the protests weren't as ugly?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, like you say, I think there's a true and a false element to the sort of comparison to Portland. I say, like a bit like you said, it's nowhere near as bad, right? Like we're not having 70 nights of continual rioting or whatever it was in Portland. You know, you're not having, police stations like lit on fire, and like it wasn't that level of. And obviously, there's no guns, which is quite a big difference to America. But like you said, there is a culture of activism of sort of left wing solidarity and sort of whatever you want to describe it as. And that has its pros and cons, right? That has its more liberal hippie side, which can be quite fun and entertaining, but it also has the sort of darker black bloc, Antifa, and anarcho-communist flag when I was there, those sorts of things. And I think for sure it played into it. And I think particularly, I would actually say the most it played into it was probably the, maybe slightly counterintuitively, the people who were just showing up, right? Because you had a lot of people who were just showing up because maybe their friend had been like, get down to the city center, big things are going on, sort of thing. And there was definitely a lot of that, people drinking, people smoking weed, and stuff like that. But I think because they're sort of, and it's somewhat national, but I think it's also quite, it's more so in Bristol, that there's a sort of anti-police attitude. And so a lot of people who maybe normally would have been like, maybe this is going a bit far, or certainly wouldn't have gone to the more extreme violent stuff themselves, were more happy to stay in the crowd because they sort of were baked in that sort of attitude. And, there'd been a lot of hostility with the Sarah Everard vigil, and the treatment of the Extinction Rebellion protesters last year. And, obviously there's lots of different perspectives on that, but from the sort of left-wing activist perspective, there's sort of been a building hostility, the BLM protests, etc. And so I think that atmosphere and the history of Bristol sort of activist culture certainly escalated things and played into the narrative.
Is the rhetoric and the sort of the activistic impulse, does it feel quite Americanized to you?
Certainly elements of it. I think you can tell there's sort of a melding going on. There's sort of the classic old British protest mentality of like, we're going to go out in force, but we're going to be peaceful. We're going to chant. We're going to we'll do all those things. But you could tell there's that more militant activist side that I think is come out of America and is sort of leaching on into Britain, along with a lot of American cultural things that's definitely seems to be picking up pace. And I think particularly the hostility to the police, I would pick up that as a bit. If you look at polls and things like that, Brits have traditionally, we have our issues. I'm not saying the police are perfect by any stretch. I'm very critical in some aspects, but there's definitely a more innately hostile vibe that comes out of America, like we saw over the summer, and that seems to really be picking up speed in Britain, for sure.
Yeah, the signifier seems to be slogans like ACAB, abolish the police.
There was a lot of that,
yeah. Which feels completely alien, especially referring to them as cops. Like that that's the most American. Like, if it was all coppers are bastards, I'd be a bit more.
Yeah. There was a funny one as well. It's obviously not related to these protests, but there was during the Black Lives Matter protests, and I think it was in London, where they were chanting "Hands up, don't shoot."
Right.
British police officers who don't have guns, which is always amusing.
Strange. So the area that around your place where you saw the protests, it's quite near to Stokes Croft, right?
Yes, I think it is. I'm not too familiar with that area, but I think it's relatively close by. Yeah.
It has that sort of vibe to it. I recall being, quite a sort of. There's quite a lot of like squats there, and it's quite.
Yes.
It's where the more sort of anarchist component comes from.
That's what I've heard.
Well, the area I want to end on is you personally. What has in any way has what you witnessed altered your mood about living in Bristol, as someone who's not only young and a student but also of the right?
I would say no, with caveats. I think if this was going to be a regular occurrence, if this was going to be every month, say it did move towards being more of a Portland, like where this was baked into the sort of atmosphere of the place, and this was just going to be all the time, and particularly the police, you know, fell sort of further and further back from being able to enforce the law. I definitely would consider leaving. I mean, it's certainly somewhere. I'm at university at the moment. It's certainly somewhere I'd be looking as a potential to live after university. But the other thing I would say as well is that one of the reasons I think it isn't going to be so typical, and I could be wrong because there are more ideological elements that maybe would be more interested in sort of keeping this sort of thing up. But we have to remember the context of not only you have the protesting bill, which I think is quite an extreme move by the government, but you also have the lockdowns, right? And you know, wherever you sit on the lockdowns, however happy or angry you are with them and the length and all those things, it's pretty hard to deny. I think that it's riled people up. It's worse than mental health. It's sort of fed into a lot of the inequalities and the problems, and just the sheer thing of like, and I saw a lot of this, a lot of young people just being like, I just want to get out and maybe, you know, let off some steam, and you know,
But yeah,
I think that sort of thing has played into it a lot.
yeah, it happened last year too, didn't it? I mean, the BLM protests happened
Yeah.
was the tail of the first lockdown, and people were, you know, yeah, cooped up, cabin fevered, and ready to go. So Bristol still you think a nice place then?
Yeah, and that's that was one thing actually I wanted to quickly say is I've seen a lot of people, particularly responding to like the Andy No article and things sort of saying like Bristol's a shithole, Bristol's this, Bristol's that. I have to say my experience of living there for a year almost now has been, and you know, granted, you know, it's not that long a time, but it's a wonderful city. People are very friendly. You know, it's a lovely place to live. I've really loved moving there. I've not been a city kid myself. I've always lived in sort of country towns and seaside towns and things like that. And I've really loved living there. And I would hope people won't see this on the news and go, that's what Bristol is, you know, because it really isn't. And even a lot of people around, you know, even if a lot of people had sympathy with the protest, you know, I spoke to a lot of the security guards at my building and like sort of regular working class people in the city, and they weren't happy about it, you know. This wasn't like, oh yeah, how great those heroes, you know, going about smashing things and setting things on fire. And a lot of people don't want that sort of attention for their city. They know how nice Bristol is, and they know, you know, people see that and don't want to come. So as much as, you know, it's a good thing to talk about, I love talking about it. I'm very happy to be here talking about it. I don't want people to come away with the perception that this is just what Bristol's all about. You know?
Yeah, no, I like Bristol. Yeah, it's an attractive city. It's quite eccentric, which I mean, obviously, as we've seen, can go one or two ways. But
Certainly.
yeah, it's a fun town. Yeah, I mean, that's what I really want to go over, man. I think that's a pretty good overview of the very brief Bristol uprising.
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries, mate.